Well, what those brothers didn't realize who were living up here in Canaan, or modern-day Israel, is that down here in Egypt, some things were happening. God was orchestrating circumstances to elevate Joseph to a position of political prominence. They went through a period of several years where there was a great famine, 7 years of famine of good years and 7 years of hard years. And so while to prepare for these 7 years of famine, Joseph was the mastermind behind this, to gather grain, so much grain down here in Egypt that when these 7 years of famine would come, they would have enough to eat. All right? When the 7 years of famine started, then here is Jacob and all of Joseph's brothers up here in Israel, and they don't have anything to eat. So what do? They come down to Egypt. And this is several years later now. Little Joseph has grown up to be a man. And so guess who they have to meet before in order to get approval to get grain? And when Joseph sees them and realizes who it is, it's all he can do to contain himself. But he plays games with them. Did you notice that? I like that. He plays games with them. And of course, finally, he can stands it no more, as Popeye says. And he revealed who he was. But his dream had come true. They came and they bowed before Joseph. How about that? And Joseph said, why don't you all come on down here and live? Pharaoh loved Joseph. Anything Joseph wanted, Pharaoh would get for him. Because of a series of bad circumstances, you read the story, Joseph was elevated to second, right next to Pharaoh. So Joseph was Pharaoh's right-hand man. And so he brought his family, and now Jacob and the brothers came down here, 70 of them, down into Egypt. And there they live for the next few hundred years. So this story of Joseph answers these questions. How were God's people spared during the time of famine? Roger said it correctly. Think, what if Jacob and all the sons would have died during the famine? What happens to the promise? What happens to the covenant? God made a way by orchestrating history to take Joseph down into Egypt, knowing that when the hard times came, then Jacob could take it, he and his sons could come down into Egypt, and there they could live, and there they could eat, and there they could survive, and the covenant and the promise would continue. God will make a way. Now listen, there's a sermon in here somewhere for us individually. When you hit a dead end in any area of your life, whether it be financially or vocationally or maritally or personally or whatever it may be, if you trust, God will make a way. When it seems like everything's lost, God, my God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where is your promise to me? Why have you let me down? If you trust, God will make a way. So he made a way for his covenant and his plan to continue. Now, next week when we get into the book of Exodus, by then the Israelites are large in number. Well, the question then, how did they become such a large number of people in a foreign land? The story of Joseph tells us. How is it when we get to the book of Exodus, the Israelites are not living in Israel, they're living in Egypt? The story of Joseph tells us. So the story of Joseph is a beautiful story of providence. Now look, I want to give you a verse. Hopefully you'll never forget it. But let me say this before I have you to turn to it. And that is this. Anytime you encounter problems, look at that problem with 50-20 vision. Turn to Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Chapter 50, verse 20. Look at what Joseph said to his brothers. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. In other words, you intended this for evil, but God intended it for good.